Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Chris with InsideTheU. A very disappointing performance by the second-ranked Miami Hurricanes, losing 24-21 to Louisville, dropping to 5-1 on the season, 1-1 in the ACC. There's a lot of disappointing things that I want to get into, both offensively and defensively, as well as some post-game comments that took me by surprise. But let's start with the final drive of the game here. Regardless of how I got to this point, Miami trailed 24-21 after a big fumble forced by the defense, a touchdown there by Tony, 2-point conversion, another defensive stop by the defense. And look, Miami takes over right behind me at their own 15-yard line, 4 minutes to go, all 3 timeouts, needing just a field goal to tie. A touchdown wins the game, essentially, is the way you're looking at it. And it didn't happen that way at all. Look, Miami did move across to midfield. They kept their timeouts in pocket, which I thought was a little interesting. I thought they could have used it at times just to kind of regroup at times, and they finally did use a timeout. 36 seconds left after a Jordan Lyle first down. They're down to the 31-yard line. And certainly 36 seconds left, at that point, you're probably thinking field goal. And that's probably what they were thinking. But regardless, on the play out of the timeout, Carson Beck, it looked like a terrible throw, and it was. It was intercepted, very easy, short pass to the right, and that essentially ended the game right there, ended Miami's chances at a comeback. And look, this could have been a game where you get the win, somehow you figure out a way to win the game. You needed to figure out a way to win the game to keep everything in line that you've been playing for, that you've built up through the first 5 games. And then it's one of those games that you could have went back and looked at all the things you did wrong and how you got lucky to come away with the win because you were being outplayed on both sides of the ball. But that's not what happened. Miami did lose the game. And this was interesting on post-game comments by Carson.
I mean, we have a perfect play for it. We had a miscommunication with the route and what we were doing. So, just ran the route wrong, and I went to go throw it because we're hot off of a pressure. And again, he made a good play with it. So, but it definitely didn't help that we ran the wrong play.
And look, he went to the podium. It was good to hear his comments on his performance. 4 interceptions, terrible performance by him. I thought there were some bad throws in there for sure. Thought it was interesting. He actually threw Elijah Lofton. Didn't say him by name, but we all know that's who he was throwing to. He said Lofton essentially ran the wrong route, ran the wrong play. That's why it was an interception on the final play of the game. That was disappointing to hear from a leader. And look, he could have said something a little bit different. And certainly when a player does that, look, Carson didn't play well at all this game. And that's the one he wants to pinpoint. And I know he did say, he did try to own it a little bit about his performance, how he needs to play better. But look, I think he should have made a very strong point of emphasis about his other interceptions. And he did give credit to him, but if he played better, they wouldn't have been in that position. And Elijah, certainly, if he's running the wrong route, why is he out there? That's a bad performance by him. Also, on that drive, he had a false start. So Elijah Lofton's not been the impact player that some people thought he was going to be this year. These 2 plays on this final drive, not good for him. But really, it's just such a bigger picture issue with this game. Elijah wasn't a big factor at all. It was really, Carson Beck. Again, the interceptions, far too many. This guy's supposed to be a leader. He was supposed to be one of these guys early on, looked like he could possibly be the top player in the country, ACC Player of the Year. Now look, some of these things are still to play for. But this was a huge setback and a huge disappointing performance by a guy in his 6th year that was doing well and leading the offense, but too many bad mistakes in this one. So very disappointing that Carson wasn't able to put together a drive to win the game. And very curious about the game plan or what Coach Dawson wanted this team to do. Was it to go down and score a touchdown? You had 4 minutes to go with all your timeouts. That should have been the goal. And that should have been the mindset of trying to do that. Now, the offense wasn't performing real well, and you were going to be limited to essentially just passing the ball at that time. But they needed to find a way to win. And look, for a team ranked as high as they were here at home, a team that had won 11 straight home games, again, they had won against some good opponents to start the year. You needed to see that win. And what's really disappointing about all this, and again, a lot to get into, but with where this team is now, at 5-1, 1-1 in the conference, you got 2 teams playing the next day at 3-0 in the conference. And really, again, I'm going to mention this once again, like I did all of last season. This is all about trying to put together a performance throughout the regular season to get to Charlotte. Look, I know this team has high hopes and maybe they can have one of these crazy great seasons, but it's all about finding a way to get to Charlotte, however that might be. And then once you get a chance to get to Charlotte, talk about that game and win and move on. But this really does put a damper on that. Look, only 2 games in the conference, and they have 6 left, all in a row now. Everybody knows that. Miami coming off the bye week there now, and they play 6 straight weeks after this one. But they've got to be able to figure out to stack wins. They don't have a lot of room for error. I'm very curious what it's going to take to get to the conference championship game. Is 7-1 going to be good enough for one of these teams? 17-team conference, we will see. Or is it going to take like last year? You saw the teams, the way that they continued to win games with SMU and Clemson. Or is it going to be one of the 6-2? Regardless, Miami has to string together wins in the conference, and tonight was certainly a disappointing, but I think there's bigger issues that what we saw tonight that could pop up as the year kind of continues, that they've got to get corrected, or another loss or 2 will pile up for this team, and they will not be in Charlotte. They'll fall short of their goals in a season that built up a lot of positivity, getting ranked to number 2 in the country, looking like front runners in the conference. Some people nationally feel like this is the best team in the country. So a lot of disappointing things. And let's go back to the beginning of this game, how it even got to this point where Miami trailed 24-21, 24-13 there early in the 4th quarter. All right, so let's talk about the beginning of the game. Miami kicks off. Louisville takes the opening drives, 11 plays, 75 yards, ends on a touchdown run by Miller Moss right after a fake field goal opportunity that Miami was essentially tricked on. And so Louisville scores there. Miami doesn't do anything on its first drive and then goes down 14-0 immediately. 10 minutes into the game, that was Miami's biggest deficit of the season. Immediately at that point, I was thinking, okay, let's see what this team is all about. Essentially, this is the first time that they'd really faced adversity. As I mentioned, largest deficit of the season. They've been out in front, in control of most of these wins that they've had so far. Certainly against tough opponents, but not facing the deficit and things not going well in a game, which happens at time to time, even with good teams. And look, anybody that saw my score predictions knows that I said that I thought this was going to be a tight game for Miami. Certainly, I was surprised a lot of people thought this was going to be a blowout for Miami. I just didn't feel like that was going to be this kind of game. But with how it started, I think that Louisville really set the tone, and that was very disappointing for Miami. Playing at home, both teams coming off a bye. And look, this is another disappointing thing to hear, but Zachary Poyser, safety, said after the game that Louisville did a lot of things that they weren't prepared for. And you don't like hearing stuff like that. You want to make sure, look, yes, things can get adjusted with how teams play, but coming off a bye week, you would have hoped Miami was a little bit better prepared. They didn't look prepared for the game. They didn't look ready to play, to be honest. That's how I saw it. I didn't think they looked ready to play, not a lot of energy. It's a different game. You're not playing Florida State, Notre Dame in some high-stakes games. And Miami fell short and fell behind, and Louisville really kind of just took control from there. Even though the lead didn't grow after that point, Miami gets a couple big plays to make it 14-7. They just never were able to essentially really get back into the game the way that they would have liked. They weren't playing from ahead. They weren't doing things where it looked like Miami was a better team in this game. Tonight, it looked like Louisville was a better team. Louisville was able to run the ball. Miami was not able to do that at all. Miami was only able to run for 63 yards on 24 carries. That was extremely disappointing. I thought the offensive line didn't provide a lot of holes. It's also kind of interesting with how Miami wants to run the ball up the middle. They really want to pound it and really rely on their strength up front. This isn't a run offense that's really predicated on their offensive linemen getting out to the sideline on some pulling guard type stuff. That's just not how this team is built. That's not how they run the ball. And they weren't able to get enough holes. And Coach Cristobal said afterwards he felt like the offensive line could have provided better holes for the backs to run through. So he just felt like the offensive line, he kind of said that he felt like they could have been better, I think was his words, or that was essentially what he was trying to say or what he wanted to say about the running attack of why it didn't go very well. But I think the backs, with Mark Fletcher doing so well to start the year, it just needs to be explosive and be able to find those tough yards, and he wasn't able to do it. They got Jordan Lyle in there. That didn't work out very well running the ball. Marty Brown got in there a little bit, but it didn't matter which back was in there. They weren't able to get anything going in the run game. Really disappointing because this offense needs to be able to run the ball and pass the ball. They've got to be balanced the way I see this team. And when one unit's not able to do its end of the bargain, essentially, I think this is the kind of performance you're going to see. It's going to put a lot of pressure on the other unit. I think if Miami struggles passing the ball, which they did tonight with the interceptions, not a ton of big plays. They had some catch and run stuff from Malachi Toney, who finished with a huge yardage total, going over 100 yards, which was good to see. But it was a little choppy, with what they were doing in the passing game. But the bottom line is they've got to be able to do both. They've got to be able to be balanced. They're not going to essentially just rely on the passing game like I thought they did a year ago. Just kind of going back to Carson's performance, the 4 interceptions, that just can't happen. You can't overcome it. Even when it was at 3, that looked like it was going to be difficult to overcome. And then another one came, had 2 in the fourth quarter. Just really disappointing that he wasn't able to kind of put these behind him. And this is kind of what happened at Georgia. He had interceptions in chunks. This is what happened. This is why he essentially led the SEC in interceptions in conference play. No other quarterback had more interceptions in conference play last season. So Carson's got to be able to find a way in game to bounce back, and we've not seen that nearly enough, throughout the last couple years in particular. So that was disappointing, especially from the player that's supposed to be leading this offense. But, I touched on the running game. I also think one of the reasons why I think this offense might not be this high-powered offense like some people think it will. And look, I made this a point of why I thought this was going to be a close game. Miami came into this game 7th in the ACC in offense, scoring and total offense. So not like last year, they led the ACC, top team in the country in these categories. So Miami, just offensively, I think they lack a little bit of some playmakers also at wide receiver. You're seeing Malachi Toney make plays. You're seeing CJ Daniel make plays. After that, you're not seeing a lot of other guys making a lot of big plays. In one unit, and I talked about it earlier with Elijah Lofton, but the tight end position, I think, needs to be productive for this offense, and I just don't see it happening. Not just with tonight. It's just kind of what I thought this offense was going to be throughout the season. I think they needed to find other ways, and I just think that omission of production at that position really does hurt this offense. Now, can they still win games? Of course. Yeah, they can rely on their strengths. They still have a running game that they believe in. They still have a quarterback that they believe in. They can still put up points. I just don't think it's going to be this high-powered offense that a lot of people are hoping that they have with this team. I think this team is just going to be kind of excelling at its best when it's balanced all around, where all units, all 4 groups, and special teams are doing well. Maybe not necessarily great in particular categories, in particular areas, but just solid, balanced, not making a lot of mistakes. Speaking of making mistakes, look, this team has been the most heavily penalized team in the ACC coming into this game. I don't like that recipe for teams trying to, compete for a conference championship. And Miami in this game had 9 penalties, more than what they've been averaging each game this season. So that can't happen. That's a hard thing to overcome. And you're seeing all kinds of different penalties also. Different players, different, offense and defense, whatever it might be. They've got to be able to cut that down. It's got to, at some point, it has to click in that if Miami really wants to have a successful season, they've got to be able to limit penalties, especially in tight games, especially in games when things aren't going well. You can't afford these mistakes to happen. So that was very disappointing. I don't know what they're going to do to correct it. It's not been corrected. It's been an issue for years, even before Cristobal, but even when Cristobal's been here. They've not been an upper half team in penalties. They've been in that lower half, kind of towards the bottom at times, as they are this season. So that's a mistake. I think they've got to be able to be more disciplined, especially I just think winning teams do have more discipline when it comes to limiting penalties. I'd feel better about this team if they were able to kind of cut that down, and hopefully they do moving forward. I feel like I'm getting a little long-winded here, but just there's a lot of thoughts in my head with this team, and a lot of things to discuss, defensively. We talked about offensively, defensively, just not able to get enough pressure, and it kind of reminds me of that second game of the year against Bethune-Cookman. I remember asking Corey Heatherman about this because it was a quick passing game. And I think you're going to see that. And Poyser said it afterwards. He does think it's going to come now. And that's what Louisville did, a quick passing game to try to alleviate some of this pressure that the defensive line, Ruben Bain in particular, can put on a quarterback. So I think they're going to see that. Look, when you put stuff on film, as the games start piling up, teams are going to try to find ways to limit what you're doing best. And I think that's one way teams are going to try to attack Miami, to try to take Ruben Bain out of it, to try to prevent the defensive line really wrecking things up front. So some quick throws, and I thought Miami in the back end really struggled, couldn't contain Chris Bell, was a huge issue. I thought O.J. Frederick didn't play very well. I thought the other defensive backs could have done a little bit more there. And what you saw at times too, because they weren't able to contain Isaac Brown either, a Homestead native had a huge game, goes over for 100 yards. Clearly you see the explosiveness in his game, the agility, the speed, the quickness. You know, I remember the 3rd and 10 play where he gets the ball and reels off 20 yards and they go on to get a touchdown. So he just made a number of big plays. But I thought because they were running the ball so well, and this is what Miami wants to do, because Louisville was able to run the ball so well, Moss was able to kind of do some play action stuff and throw some quick hitters in the middle of the field where the linebackers were a little bit trapped on where they needed to be because they did have to respect the run, and they really weren't able to kind of affect the passing game maybe as well as they would have liked either. But in that scenario, the cornerbacks have to be able to cover a little bit better, disrupt the pass a little bit better, get your hands on the ball a little bit better. You know, Chris Bell, I do think he's the best wide receiver in the ACC, but there's other good wide receivers in the ACC that Miami will see. They just have to be much better moving forward, and hopefully this is a learning experience for a lot of guys on the team, offensively and defensively, because a lot of guys just needed to play better. They almost kind of squeaked by with the victory, but bottom line is they've got to play better. They did not get the result, so certainly they should know that they have to play better, and they're going to have to, or other, again, as I mentioned earlier, other losses going to happen. So I am going to wrap this up. Coach Cristobal talked afterwards, didn't talk for very long, didn't really say anything in particular that stood out to me. It wasn't anything surprising. He's pretty, you know, we've got to execute better, we've got to play better, these kinds of things. It was disappointing. That's typically how he talks in losses like this, but we won't know how this team's going to respond moving forward. Very curious to see how they do. Last year we know where they had the loss to Georgia Tech, they did get a win, and then that loss to Syracuse, the loss in the bowl game, they ended 3 of the last 4 with losses. Everybody knows that after starting 9-0. This team started 5-0. A lot to play for. Carson Beck did say afterwards, look, we're not going to be judged on one game. It's a 12-game season. So we'll see how he does moving forward. Hopefully this is his worst game of the season. They can't afford for him to play like this if they want to continue to win games, if they want to get to Charlotte, which I know they want to. They could come back out here against Stanford next week, no break. I think it's good for a team after losses, but really after wins too. You know, you want to be in a rhythm. They're going to be in a rhythm now, but they've got to be able to shake this, understand what they did wrong, and then also find ways just to be better. And we'll see what this team does moving forward. Stanford, I don't expect to provide much of a challenge for Miami, even though they didn't look great in this one. I do think Louisville does have a good team, certainly, and I think they can be in tension, obviously, with this win. They go to 2-1 in the ACC, so we'll see how they do moving forward as these teams, again, trying to stay away from that second loss in the conference. I think that's the biggest thing right now. Pay attention to those teams, you know, that kind of stay under 2 losses. But that's going to wrap everything up for me. It is late. It's always good seeing the grounds crew kind of get the field cleaned up and ready. But whenever I'm doing this, it's after a long day, a long night, so I am going to wrap up. I definitely appreciate everybody for showing their support, watching the video to the end. Shout out to you. I know this isn't a fun video to watch. A lot of people have been very excited about this team. I do understand some of the negativity towards it with this loss, obviously, but maybe we'll see some positive stuff once again in the near future. Maybe this team can get back on track. That's the plan. We'll see how things go, though, moving forward. Looking forward to the next game. Looking forward to kind of seeing how things go with this team, but got to get things corrected. That's going to wrap it up. Again, thanks again for your support. Thanks for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of the weekend, and take care.